I'm glad to be able to introduce Dr. Eberhard Kölsch, who is here with us today, has been with us here this week, and will be vacationing actually here. He is not new to this area. He may tell you about an earlier experience that he and his wife had many, many years ago. He was here just about 10 years ago. He has been with the Foreign Service for since 1972. He is currently the number 2 man in the embassy, and that is when anything goes wrong in the embassy, they basically look to Dr. Kölsch, or when anything goes right, then they look to the ambassador. Is that right? You'll find him to be a very fascinating individual. I watched this morning as they spoke about the Euro and the European Union, and if you have questions there, please feel free to ask questions. Dr. Kölsch is not someone who comes here with just a prepared presentation, but he is one who has served in some significant positions of responsibility in New York, in London, in Washington, and who will be not only bright in his presentation and be able to move to with some very difficult issues, but also will be able to respond to your questions about what's going on in the world, the challenges of diplomacy and of working in his area. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Dr. Eberhard Kölsch, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission of the German Embassy in Washington and the number 2 man in that embassy. Dr. Kölsch. Thank you.
Many thanks for this kind introduction, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon. You're very courageous to come to this course at this time of the day. It's normally eating time, so I try to give you some food for thought. But for me, it's very important to be here with you today because, first of all, my life mainly happens in Washington. And Washington is not the United States. We know this, but we have to come out of the Beltway every now and then to experience it, and it's a wonderful experience. And I'm very pleased that I can have the next 50 or 40 minutes with you with such an experienced group that is so widely traveled, speaks so many languages, and has such an open mind. What I would like to do is just to make a couple of brief remarks. We live now with a new administration, with a new president, who likes to come to the point very quickly. Please keep speeches short, that's the message. Very much like this 12-year-old girl who won the essay writing contest on Socrates. She wrote, Socrates was a Greek philosopher. He talked too much. They poisoned him. So, let me just say that looking at this map, we realize that at the verge of the new millennium, we live in a completely different world than we did 10 years ago. I would say this is true for the United States, and the catchphrase is globalization. I remember writing a report when I was Deputy Consul General in New York in February 1993 on globalization. And I was very proud of what I had found out. I wrote back to my minister that 2 things had changed the world. First, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the disappearance not only of the border between East and West Germany, but the disappearance of borders all over the world, the opening of new markets, the reform of formerly socialist or communist countries trying to become democratic systems and changing into market economies. This was true for certain parts of South America, certain parts of Asia, certain parts of Africa. So that was one thing. And the other thing was technology, new ways of communication. The news of the attack on the Bastille that started the French Revolution in 1789 took 3 days to travel by horse for 90 miles from Paris to the Franco-German border. This morning I spoke a couple of times with my ambassador in Washington, and I woke up with the final results of this Nikkei index in the stock exchange from Tokyo on CNN. We have car factories, German car factories today in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, in South Carolina, North Carolina, BMW and Mercedes-Benz. And they are there because the German companies have realized in order to be successful, they have to be in the American market. And these companies are there because the time difference is 6 hours. And these companies can be managed from Germany via telephone, fax, email, and people can talk to each other in the German afternoon and the American morning so that they're in constant touch with each other. So this is how the world has changed, and 3 billion people out of these 6 billion people have been integrated into the world economy. In 1993, I surprised my superiors back home with the story of this American manufacturer of a software program, where if you bought the program, you had some assistance during the first year on an 800 number. And if you would call in the morning, somebody with a slightly Irish accent would answer from Cork in Ireland, 1993. And in the afternoon, somebody from Guam in the Pacific, where they also speak English, would answer. Because telecommunication, telephone costs have become so cheap. And in addition, we have a worldwide working communication system. Containers today can be shipped around the globe, across the world, and land on the hour at the port where they're supposed to be. Now, this is the phenomenon, in a couple of words, as I see globalization. But Germany, over the last 10 years, had to cope with 2 additional phenomena. The biggest and most outstanding was German unification. Germany is united since October 1990, roughly 10 years now. But for America, which was very helpful in bringing about German unification, this was the end of an external policy process where you work together with the Soviet Union and then Russia and the other Western European countries. For us, the challenge started with German unification because we didn't know what to expect and there was no textbook. East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, was the front runner among the communist countries. And when we had a chance to look what was there really, we found out that either the books were not correct or they didn't know how to keep the books correctly. And there was big surprise because at the same time, with German unification, Soviet Union, or now Russia, that was the traditional market for German Democratic Republic goods, changed its policy and said, we want to go on the open market now. We buy on the open market and we pay hard currency, but we also sell only against hard currency. And so overnight, East Germany lost about 80% of its traditional market. Another point was that people in East Germany, 17 million, they were eager to get the same standard of living like the people in West Germany. And they said, if the Deutschmark does not come to us, we will go to the Deutschmark. Now, West Germany, 62 million people. East Germany was 17 million people at the time. Now, we couldn't definitely not take in 17 million people. If you add it all up together, today we're 82 million people. That is the state of the size of Montana. That's the United Germany. The state of the size of Montana, with a population of the U.S. west of the Mississippi without California. So this gives you an idea what the United Germany today is. Montana, population west of the Mississippi without California. So we introduced the Deutschmark very quickly in East Germany. At an exchange rate for the first 2,000 Deutschmarks 1-on-1 on the black market, the exchange rate was 6 East German marks against 1 Deutschmark, so they made a killing. And for the amount above 2,000 Deutschmark, the exchange rate was 1 to 2. So if you aggregate this all, the exchange rate was 1 to 1.6. Sometimes I say here in this country, I can't say this in Germany, we paid US wages with the productivity of Mexico. And this was very difficult for the development in East Germany because there was nothing there. They had old copper phone lines, but they didn't even have a proper phone system. Well, they had more than one system because information was segregated. If you were a party official, you were linked up to the party telephone system. If you were a Stasi, that means a secret police agent, you were linked up to the secret police telephone system. If you were in the chemical industry, you were linked up to the chemical industry telephone system. And sometimes you see pictures of communist leaders with 6 or 8 or 10 telephones on their desks. And I always thought, oh boy, these guys must be busy. But the fact is that their power and their importance is shown by the fact that they're linked up to all these separate telephone systems. And for example, if you wanted to make a call under the communist East Germany from Leipzig to Dresden, the phone call would go from Leipzig up north to Berlin, where the guys from the Stasi, secret police, were listening in, and from there it would go to Dresden. Now what we did is we put in fiber optics all over the place. And today East Germany has the most modern telecommunication system in Europe. The banks, the corporations that moved over to East Germany, they tried to push into East Germany their 286 computers. That was medium advanced technology at the time, but the guys in East Germany said, no, we want 486. That was the top technology. So they got the top technology. Much money went into investment, roughly $100 billion a year. So if you factor this up by 10, it's $1,000 billion that Germany sent over into East Germany in order to develop the infrastructure. This is why our debt in the budget went up. And this changes is true in many areas, and we can discuss this in detail afterwards. So there's globalization and there is German unification. And the third phenomenon we had to cope with over the last 10 years is the integrated single European market. What is the integrated single European market? The whole European integration started with France and Germany getting together and thinking, what a good idea would it be if we had a common market for agricultural goods. France in the mid-50s was still very much agricultural, Germany rather industrial, so we would support their agriculture and they would buy our industrialized goods. Today things have developed and France is as industrialized as we are. But it was a market for goods by doing away with the tariff barriers within Europe among the various countries. Then it became also a market for services. But in order to be a true single integrated market, it's not only the tariffs that are obstacles, there are also the non-tariff barriers, such as the labeling, the size of the bottles. So one country said, say we only allow a half a liter bottle. The other one would say we only allow a 0.45 bottle. Would say we need on the label more information than the other guys. So they invented all kinds of things in order to keep products out. Now in the integrated single market, this is no longer possible. So suddenly a German company was competing head-on with an Italian or French and so on company. So Germany had to adjust to these three phenomena at the same time: globalization, German unification, and European integration, the single European market. This European single market business was agreed during the 80s. And in the beginning of the 90s, in order to make German unification acceptable to all our neighbors, and if you look on the map figure this out. We are right here in the middle, surrounded by 10 neighbors. United States, 1, 2 neighbors. Life is a lot easier with 2 neighbors, especially if you have natural borders, a lot of water on both sides. In Germany, you drive 2 hours, you're in Belgium, they speak a different language. You drive 2 hours, you're in Luxembourg, they speak their own language. You drive another 2 hours from Bonn, you're in France, they speak a different language. And you drive 2 hours from Berlin to the east, you're in Poland, different language. So that is a completely different ball game. And in order to get German unification accepted by all these neighbors, we agreed to go further in the European integration by becoming a true political union with more powers to the European Parliament in Strasbourg and also more powers to the Commission. And also introducing a common currency, the euro, which is in effect for debiting and invoices since the 1st of January 1999, but which will also be given out as coins and bills starting on the 1st of January next year. So this is a psychological phenomenon that will happen. People will feel even more united within this European Union. At the same time, it was not only, I like this map, it's beautiful. It's not only integrating East Germany into the united Germany, but it was also a tremendous reform process in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And this is why the European Union agreed to open up to new candidate countries in the East, to Poland, to the 3 Baltic states, to the Czech Republic, to the Hungarian Republic, to Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia, Slovak Republic, Malta, Cyprus, altogether 13 countries that are eligible to become members of the European Union if they fulfill certain criteria. And these criteria were laid down at the summit meeting in 1993 in Copenhagen by the European heads of state and government. And they said these countries have to restructure their systems, their political systems, by allowing more than one party, not only the Communist Party, but also other parties, by introducing a judiciary, an independent legal system, by introducing the rule of law. This is as far as the political and the legal system is concerned. By also introducing a market economy, by having transparent pricing, by introducing antitrust laws, restructure the whole country. Now this meant tremendous sacrifices for the people there, especially for people who were used that the state does everything for them. From being a little child until you die, total control, total tutelage, or whatever you will call it. And now suddenly they were encouraged to take an initiative, to be critical, to make a judgment. That's not very easy for many people who have done the opposite for 40 years and were taking an initiative, or having an independent idea of your own could be fatal. So this is a tremendous change. In order to do this, the European Union and its member states have set up aid and assistance programs by sending over consultants, sending officials into these countries, and helping them to set up a system which is compatible to what we have in the European Union or what you have here in this country. That costs a lot of money. And from 1990 until the year 2005, this is where the financial programming for the European ends, the European Union alone will have sent over as grants and gifts to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe 136 billion euros, roughly 130 billion US dollars. Why do I mention this? When I go back to Washington, I will have to fight the reproach by my US counterparts that Germany is not doing enough for defense. We spend roughly 1.1% of our cross-national product for defense. The US spends roughly 2.2, double, compared to 3.5 in the early 80s under President Reagan. And my counter-argument is that the European Union and Germany as a member country spend a lot of money in order to produce and to export stability into the area of Central and Eastern Europe in a non-military way. All this money for restructuring Central and Eastern Europe, these structural funds, this consultancy, all this is not accounted for in our defense budget. And sometimes I come up with the idea, wouldn't it be wonderful to have something like a stability budget where we could factor in all these expenses that we have. And also, if we look at other parts of the world, like Africa or Asia, development cooperation. I have this is my discussion fighting book here, which I always carry with me with all the facts and figures if people get testy, so I can just come up with the opposite proof. But for development cooperation expense, the other way around, Germany spends twice the amount on a per capita basis as the US does. Africa, Asia, certain parts of South America. And these are also expenditures for stability and peace in the world. And this also has to be taken into account. Now I could go on, and I have this wonderful prepared lecture on the new challenges facing the new administration in the US and a European view on that. And I would talk about Russia, I would talk about China, I would talk about missile defense, about European security and defense policy, about trade disputes like the banana war, which we have happily settled, the question of hormone-treated beef, the foreign sales corporations, the genetically modified food, but I will spare you with that because I want to take back something from you, and I always gain a lot by having your questions and by learning from what is on your mind, and this is why I would end now and look forward to your questions. Thank you. Yes, please. Economically, we have put a lot of money in. It's the most wonderful infrastructure in the world. But what is still lacking is enough private individuals that have an entrepreneurial spirit, that are prepared to take a risk. Helmut Schmidt, our former chancellor, once said, to make a real entrepreneur takes one night, 9 months, and 40 years. Now, the problem in East Germany is, I think we changed the market economy to a centrally planned warfighting economy roughly in the year 1938. So somebody who was 20 years old in 1938, he would have been in 1990 something like 72. Now with 72 you don't start a new business. So a whole generation of experience in entrepreneurship and market economy is lacking. And we're now seeing the first young generation in East Germany growing up, prepared to take a risk and to become an entrepreneur. In material terms, nobody in East Germany is suffering. What is happening? You had, under communist rule, everybody had a job. There is this pun where somebody says, we pretended to work and they pretended to pay us. So that was the arrangement. Now, because everybody in the working age was assigned a job. And what we did after unification is we coordinated their jobs with our jobs in the West and assumed that they had paid into Social Security during that period without them having paid in. Now, everybody gets a pension for these 50 years of his life that he is missing out of the West German funds, transfer payments. Also, all the people that are unemployed get rather attractive unemployment benefits. 68% of your last net wages, which sometimes is more than what they had before. Now, in a system where you had 100% employment, you have many households in East Germany where 2 adults receive unemployment benefits. These are the people whom you meet in Florida or the Grand Canyon because they're traveling all over the world with this money, having the feeling they have to catch up for 50 years of lost life. It's not a material problem. Of course, one could always use more money because there are so many things to do and to buy which they didn't have before. The problem is more a psychological problem. People in East Germany compared with the people from West Germany feel like second-class citizens. They don't have the kind of qualifications, the skills. They were not brought up to the same extent with a computer. If they traveled to Warsaw, Kiev, Minsk, and other nice places. I got my education to a certain extent at Columbia University in the 60s, which is very helpful today. Had I been an East German, I would not be here today. And this is part of the problem. Yes.
I come from Albania. There is a lot of refugees from people that emigrated in Germany and work there. But I know more than Albania. There is a lot of Turkish groups there. In the last 5 years, there's been kind of a turmoil with those groups. What is the German government doing to combat that?
Now I have to open the book. To give you the exact figures. Because these figures, I find, are so impressive. When the wall came down and borders disappeared, as I said, people from all over the world tried to get into Central Europe and especially Germany. Why? First of all, we have in our Constitution Article 16 the legal and constitutional right that everybody who is politically persecuted can claim political asylum. Now, this message spread over the world, and having seen the wall disappear, we were the last one in the world that were to put up a wall again. And now this is what happened. In 1983, 4.4 million foreigners in Germany. 4.4. Out of these 4.4 million foreigners, 1.9 million paid into Social Security. That means they had a job and paid Social Security. In 1999, 7.3 million foreigners. That means 3 million more. And instead of 1.9, you have now 2.0 million foreigners paying into Social Security. And the other 5.3 million are all fed and housed by the government. And in a way that they send money home, because what we give them is about 10 times as much as the average salary in Romania. And they all had to pretend that they're asylum seekers. And we had these funny cases where some asylum seekers applied for vacation money to go home to their home country where they are politically persecuted. So today we have 7.3 million foreigners, 2.1 million Turks, 720,000 from former Yugoslavia. And in addition to these roughly 3 million foreigners, we took in 2.5 million people from the former Soviet Union. These were Soviet citizens of German nationality. That's a unique phenomenon. In the 18th century, Catherine the Great invited German settlers going to Russia and to help up Russia and Central and Eastern Europe. And in our constitution after the war, when there was this high wall towards the east in the communist countries, we said whoever makes it from this part of the world and can claim German descent, we will take him in, give him a German passport immediately, and he will enjoy all the social benefits. Now, when the wall came down, 2.5 million people took advantage of that. And this in an environment, and this is the question as far as East Germany is concerned, especially where people were not used to foreigners. In East Germany, in communist East Germany, you had Russian troops stored and hid away in barracks, not in contact with the population. And you had a couple of Vietnamese, North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese, because they were also communist and they were in the communist East Germany. And now suddenly you were in an environment where 40% of the population had lost their jobs because they were no longer competitive. And in this environment came hundreds of thousands of so-called asylum seekers who, after having gone through the legal process of questioning whether they're true asylum seekers, only 6% were recognized as true asylum seekers. But we were not in a position, and there was no public support to send the others home, because the government, the parties, opposition and government, could not agree on a reform. Now, we have changed the asylum law in 1997 in a way that we said those who come by land from a safe country, and we considered France, Switzerland, Czech Republic, not as country where you are politically persecuted, they should seek asylum here. So it has trickled down a bit, but it's still some kind of a problem. Sometimes you read about xenophobic attacks in East Germany. These are just simple hate crimes that happen also in this country in a different context, and which you have to understand in this overall environment. Yes, please.
I've read about German corporations putting money into some kind of compensation fund for those who were wronged during the World War II and the Nazi regime. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how those corporations are doing that, what motivates them to do that, and do you think any of those who are wronged will actually realize any of those benefits? Because I think the monies were like $130 billion or some figure like that. That may be a little high, but
No, you're right, but there are two things. First, there is the so-called restitution payments to those who have suffered under the Nazi regime. People that have lost their homes, their property, and this money, roughly the amount you quoted, has accumulated since roughly 1950 that the government has been paying that. But now, where all this was settled, there is a lobby, I might say, which is also due to the American legal system, the class action suit, where you can bring action against somebody with an unlimited number of claimants. Is that the word? Yeah. Now, there is no legal base for any German company to pay a remuneration for forced labor. This is forced labor, people who were forced to work against their will, or slave labor in the concentration camps. But the German companies decided that if the government pays half of a considerable amount, they would put some money in such a fund on a moral ground, not as a moral closure, because what has happened is never to be forgotten, but as a kind of a financial gesture in order to avoid a boycott of German goods or to create bad feeling towards Germany. And the arrangements were that it should be 5 billion Deutschmarks, so in today's money that's roughly $2 billion from the corporations, and another 5 billion Deutschmarks from the government. Now, the hitch is that the 5 billion from the corporations are tax deductible, so that makes a government contribution of 7 billion Deutschmarks. And before paying out the money, they wanted what they call legal closure or legal security, that all the class action suits that were filed against the German companies are redrawn. And we had just the very prominent case last week with Judge Kramer in New York, and another case early this week. So there are 2 more cases pending, and once these are withdrawn, the German companies will get together and form an opinion whether they consider this legal closure, and then the German Bundestag, the parliament, will take a decision before the summer break and say, yes, we consider as is as legal closure. And the U.S. government has agreed to give a statement of interest that any further class action suits would be against U.S. interests. And then this money will be paid out through Jewish organizations in this country, in Central and Eastern Europe, to the people concerned, or also their heirs, is that it? Heirs, their heirs, for the terrible destiny they suffered. Yes?
I spent last fall in London, and I know you've spent time there as well. And in reading the London papers, it would seem as though the United States is across the channel rather than continental Europe. So much more attention was paid to what's going on in the United States. Could you tell me your perspective on Britain's role in Europe and the integration or lack of integration?
Yes. I mean, countries have different histories. The history of my country is more an incentive to look to the future, at least the history in the last century. The history of Britain is more incentive to look to the past. And when you're living in London, every evening you can see films about World War II, Britain at its finest hour. And when you live in Britain and you walk, and this is what I did with my family, I did the Cornwall Coast Path, the Devonshire Coast Path for days. And you walk along these cliffs and you have the wide open sea in front of you, and you have the cliffs and the land behind you. You have the feeling of a true national identity. When you drive from Bonn 2 hours to Aachen and Liège in Belgium, you don't even know where the border is anymore. Everything has disappeared. We have mantled down the border posts and so forth. So if I were a Brit, I would have a true national identity. I would be proud of my glorious past, how I stood up to the dictatorship, how I fought for freedom and democracy and so forth. How I had a great empire, which unfortunately is lost now. You all know, well, it's not funny for them. You all know the famous phrase, teenage ancient Britain has lost an empire but not yet found a new role. And that's part of it. But the Brits make an important contribution when it comes to organizing our economical system, because some countries in Europe, like France, are much more state intervention oriented. Colbert and the system of state-owned factories. Whereas the British are entrepreneurs, capitalists, so we need them as good allies for free trade. We also work very closely together with them in the European security and defense policy. And if you follow closely Prime Minister Blair's statement in Britain, and there are articles in today's papers, you will see how carefully he has to maneuver within the British public to steer too close to the euro, but not to steer too far away from it. And this is due to 2 facts. I mean, the pound, the money in the army are the incarnation of national sovereignty. And second, the British press is owned to a large extent by Rupert Murdoch, Australian by birth, but also at home in this country, and he is strongly against the euro. And every day, the Murdoch papers, the Sun, the Mirror, and all the others, the Times, they write against the euro. And the Conservative Party, we discuss this so freely today in Europe because it's domestic European policy. It's no longer mingling into internal affairs of another country, foreign country. It's domestic European policy. So the Conservatives are so desperate and their leadership is so weak that the only thing they have that unites them against the Labour Party is the skepticism towards the euro and the European integration, and there are wonderful jokes about it.
Thank you. We have time for one more quick question.
Since the Rogers Act in 1924, American diplomatic and consular services have been combined into one corps. I understand that Germany maintains separate diplomatic and consular services. There's been some commentary lately from American consular officers, mostly that maybe consular services are better served separate from the diplomatic background, from the diplomatic corps as well. What is your experience working with a separate diplomatic corps in Germany?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question because it gives me the opportunity to say that we also have a combined service. So here we're also together. And that is a very good experience, I must say, in my case, because it allowed me to be Deputy Consul General in New York, and now Deputy Ambassador in Washington, which is wonderful. But apart from that, it's also a good experience to deal with the nitty-gritty of everyday life. And this is what consuls do to a larger extent to what ambassadors do. And we are really paid to be generalists. To develop a certain set of skills. We're not paid for knowing everything, but we're paid for getting to know very quickly the people who know everything. And when you have a combined service, consular and diplomatic, you have a much larger pool to draw from in order to fill 180 posts around the world. But may I use the opportunity to line out another difference which we have between the American and the German system. The dream of every German Foreign Office official is to become an ambassador one day, and it's a dream that is feasible and in most of the cases can be fulfilled at a rather early stage, because we have in the whole diplomatic service, I think we have 1 or 2 political appointees. So we are non-partisan, we are trained, our foreign policy as such is bipartisan, and I think it's wonderful to be a deputy ambassador in Washington. I mean, you could have been an ambassador in a smaller country since a long time, but I work with very dedicated and very enthusiastic colleagues because they all work to fulfill their dream to be an ambassador one day, and maybe even ambassador in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you.